All right. In this screencast, we're going to look at VUS 7, which is about the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and see how they were major turning points in American history. Um, in the first episode, we're going to discuss the main causes of the Civil War, including the role of slavery as a principal cause of the war between states. Um, The Civil War began, you probably know, with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in South Carolina on April 12, 1861, and it will end with the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. What happened between these dates changes the lives of untold numbers of people in the country, and it's going to put our nation on a course that would eventually bring civil rights to all African Americans. So that's kind of where we're going. It's an interesting unit, so let's get going here. To start with, I want to talk about some of the causes of the war. The first thing we need to look at is sectional disagreements and the debates over tariffs. And to understand sectional disagreements, we first have to kind of define the sections we're talking about. Mainly, we're talking about the North and the South in this unit, the northern and southern parts of our country. As you know, as a result of Jefferson's embargo of 1807, the North, especially like around New England up in there, began to industrialize. Many things are being made in factories in New England, and manufacturing actually will become the bedrock of the New England economy by the mid-19th century. Textile mills were a key component of New England's economy, and textile mills make fabrics, all sorts of things made out of cloth, like clothing, sails for ships, all kinds of neat things, but you have to have cotton. In the South, however, agriculture was the foundation of the economy. Agrarian communities were all over the southern landscape. If you recall, in the 1600s in Virginia, tobacco was the cash crop of choice, but by the 1820s, and thanks in large part to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, cotton is becoming the favorite crop in the South. And cotton is going to be used to make fabrics, and up in New England. So much of the South's cotton is going to be sent to New England. In short, what you really need to take away from this is that the North, by the 19th century, is industrialized or becoming industrialized, and the South is still agrarian. Now, Northern politicians and factory owners tended to like protective tariffs. Now, we talked about protective tariffs a few units ago. Protective tariffs were designed to protect American manufacturing. Since most of the nation's manufacturing was in the North, protective tariffs provided an economic advantage to the North that other sections of the country really didn't enjoy. Southerners did not like protective tariffs for a couple of reasons. One, they felt that the government should not favor one section of the country. Let me try that again. They favored that one. Brain cramp. Rewind. Southerners felt that the government should not favor one section of the country over another with economic policies like tariffs. And number two, protective tariffs tended to bring the price of things that Southerners bought up. So Southerners ended up paying more money for the things that they needed and wanted because of these protective tariffs. Now let's look at three tariffs that illustrate sort of the intensity of the sectional disagreements between the North and the South in the first half of the 19th century. The first high protective tariff was passed by Congress in 1816 over Southern protests. 12 years later, in 1828, Congress passed a tariff act that was even higher than the one passed in 1816. In fact, it was among the highest protective tariffs in the world. Southerners were outraged and quickly nicknamed the 1828 tariff the Tariff of Abominations. And as you know, an abomination is something to be hated or something that causes disgust. Now, South Carolina was especially angry over the 1828 tariff. It had a really seriously negative impact on Great Britain, and Great Britain was one of the South's main trading partners. So that put the South at a disadvantage right away. South Carolina's economy begins to crumble after 1828, and its political leaders feared that it would really kind of lose its place as one of the richest states in the Union, and maybe even become one of the poorest states in the Union. As we know, people move for economic opportunities, and that rule applies to South Carolina in 1828. People began to leave the state as the economy there crumbled. So sort of by the end of the 1820s or somewhere in there, South Carolina will have lost some 70,000 citizens. Towards the end of the 1830s, that number is going to more than double to 150,000 people leaving South Carolina, in part or mainly because of its bad economy. And leaders in South Carolina blame the Tariff of Abominations for driving its economy into the ground. Well, President Jackson, as you know, is in office in 1828, and he himself is a Southerner, and he's going to try to lower the tariff. He convinces Congress to pass the Tariff of 1832, which is really an improvement over the Tariff of Abominations, but South Carolina is still not happy. One of the most outspoken opponents of tariffs was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and at the time, Calhoun was actually Andrew Jackson's vice president. Calhoun was vice president of the United States. In 1832, South Carolina held a constitutional convention and adopted the Ordinance of Nullification. It's a very important term, the Ordinance of Nullification, with Calhoun's blessing and encouragement. Okay, and that's very important. Calhoun is giving the go-ahead to this Ordinance of Nullification as Vice President of the United States. Let's review for a second here. Nullification, means to cancel out, right? Well, let's go back to the 1790s, and if you remember back when we were talking about, we were talking about Jefferson and Madison in that unit, I think, on the Constitution. Recall that Virginia and Kentucky. That Jefferson and Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and in them argued that states could nullify an act of Congress or of the president if they found it to be unconstitutional. So if the states found something the president did exceeded the authority given to him in the Constitution, or something that Congress did exceeded the authority given to it in the Constitution, then those states could nullify those acts or those laws and not follow them. Okay. Also recall that the 1803 case of Marbury v. Madison, in which John Marshall, who at the time was the fourth Chief Justice of the United States, introduced the idea of judicial review. Remember that term? It gave the federal courts the authority to decide whether an issue was constitutional or not. Whether, for example, if the president passed an act, if the president enacted a proclamation, or if Congress passed an act, were those things constitutional? Or even if a state assembly, a state legislature passed a law, was that constitutional? It gives the federal government, the federal courts, I should say, the final word in deciding issues of constitutionality. Okay? And Jefferson and Madison wanted to keep that power in the states. So, rolling back here, South Carolina's Ordinance of Nullification is a continuation then of this whole idea of the states having the power to nullify something. That's a 3 decades old argument by this point between those who wanted to keep or concentrate power in the states versus those who wanted to concentrate power in a strong central government. Okay, so this is not a new argument. This is an old argument. It just keeps resurfacing. So, where's this all going? Well, it's going downhill very fast, I'm afraid. Calhoun is going to resign his post as Vice President of the United States. He's going to return to South Carolina, and very quickly he's going to become a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, and he's going to return to Washington, D.C. to carry his message of nullification to Congress. Okay? Like I said earlier, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, which declared both the 1828 and the 1832 tariffs unconstitutional, unlawful, and actually prohibited citizens in South Carolina to pay the taxes. If the government collected taxes, I'm sorry, let me restate that. I think I just confused myself on that one. It made it unlawful and prohibited really any attempt by the federal government to collect these tariffs starting, I don't know, somewhere around February 1833. The South Carolina legislature also said that any South Carolina citizen whose property had been seized by the federal government for failure to pay the tariff could get the court order in South Carolina to recover twice the value of the property seized by the federal government. The idea that states could nullify acts of Congress is the basis of what is known as the states' rights argument. So if you've ever heard somebody talk about states' rights, this is really where it comes from, this whole crisis in 1832. Well, Andrew Jackson is outraged by this whole thing. And you really didn't want to be on the receiving end of Andrew Jackson's anger. Jackson issued the Nullification Proclamation in December of, I think it was 32, which said, quote, and I'm quoting right from him here, he says, "The power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state is incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed." He goes on to say that the Constitution forms the government, not a league. The people are sovereign and the Union perpetual. And that's an important term there, the Union perpetual. Jackson kind of establishes that. He says disunion by force is treason. And to give teeth to this seething anger, Jackson threatened to hang the leaders of the South Carolina movement for treason, including his old Vice President John C. Calhoun. And let me tell you, when Jackson threatened to hang you, you really needed to take that very, very seriously. Okay. Jackson then sent 3 divisions of artillery of the U.S. Army to South Carolina, and he called up volunteers in South Carolina to support the Union and stop South Carolina's treasonous activities. He also ordered naval ships to anchor in Charleston Harbor as a show of force. All this is going on in the early 1830s. Okay, we're not even close to the Civil War yet, but look how intense things are getting. South Carolina got the message in part because of the show of force that Jackson ordered, but also really because no other southern state joined them, and they were kind of left hanging out there by themselves. No other southern state wanted to defy the tariff, at least not openly. Jackson signed the Force Act and a compromise tariff, which had been hammered out by Henry Clay in Congress. Henry Clay is a very important figure in American history, and I wish we had more time to spend on him. He's known as the Great Compromiser. Anyway, soon after this thing by the Force Act by Jackson is passed, South Carolina is going to withdraw its nullification law, and the nullification crisis is over. Andrew Jackson had held up the idea of perpetual union, meaning that the union could not be dissolved by a single state or a group of states. And this idea of a perpetual union will be very important to Lincoln as the nation moves through what some historians call the final battle of the American Revolution. We're going to call it the Civil War. Okay? All right, so that's my little piece on the nullification crisis. And you need to know that. You need to understand the origin of states' rights and I guess the roles of Jackson and Calhoun and that whole controversy. Good stuff, exciting stuff. Ask me questions on Remind, or you can see me in class. So, see you later.